The station called Orion Gate floated quietly in the dark space between two star systems, and inside it hundreds of different alien species walked through the long silver halls every day. It was one of the most important diplomatic stations in the galaxy, a place where powerful empires met to talk instead of fight. And even though humans had only joined the galactic community a few years ago, they had still been allowed a small presence on the station, mostly observers and translators who simply watched and learned from older civilizations. And one of those humans was a young analyst named Daniel Hayes. He was not a soldier, not a diplomat, and definitely not someone important. His job was simple. He studied alien communication patterns and wrote reports that most high-ranking officers probably never even read, and most days were quiet and predictable, which was exactly how Daniel liked it. On that day, Daniel sat inside the observation chamber, looking through several floating screens. Strange alien symbols slowly moved across the displays, while ships from different worlds arrived and left the station outside the massive windows. Everything looked normal until suddenly the calm routine of the station broke. Red lights flashed across the hallway outside, and a loud announcement echoed through every corridor. Attention all personnel, Royal Arrival Protocol has been activated. Repeat, Royal Arrival Protocol has been activated. Daniel frowned slightly and looked up from his console. Royal Arrival Protocol was not something that happened often. In fact, he had only read about it in training manuals. Before he could think too much about it, the door behind him opened quickly, and two station security officers stepped inside. One of them was a tall, blue-skinned alien named Varric, who rarely showed any emotion. But today, even he looked tense. "Daniel Hayes," Varric said in a serious voice, "you need to come with us." Daniel blinked in confusion, but stood up slowly. "Did something happen?" he asked carefully. "Just follow us," the officer replied. They walked through several busy corridors where many alien workers had already stopped what they were doing. Whispers spread through the station like a quiet storm. Everyone knew what royal protocol meant. Someone very powerful was about to arrive, and as Daniel followed the officers, he began hearing the same name again and again in different alien languages. The Queen was coming. Queen Aranthia, ruler of one of the oldest and most feared civilizations in the galaxy. Her species had controlled entire star systems long before humans had even invented electricity, and stories about her power were whispered in many worlds. Some said she could read the intentions of entire rooms just by looking at people. Others said her species had ended wars simply by appearing on the battlefield. Daniel felt a strange chill run down his spine as he entered the central diplomatic chamber where dozens of ambassadors were already gathering. Tall reptilian delegates stood beside floating crystalline beings, while insect-like diplomats clicked their mandibles nervously. Everyone waited in respectful silence. But something strange happened then. Instead of guiding Daniel to a normal observation seat, the security officer stopped near the front of the chamber. Vera turned toward him with a serious expression and spoke quietly. "You will stay here for now." Daniel stared at him in surprise. "Here, why?" The officer hesitated for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. "Because you need to hear this warning clearly," he said. "When the Queen arrives, you must stay away from her. Do not speak to her. Do not approach her. And if she enters this area, you will leave immediately." Daniel frowned, completely confused. Why would I need to do that? Varric looked directly into his eyes and answered slowly. "Because humans make her species uncomfortable." That explanation made almost no sense. Daniel was just an analyst who spent most of his time studying symbols on screens. Why would someone like him matter to a galactic ruler? But before he could ask another question, the massive doors of the diplomatic chamber slowly opened. A deep silence filled the room as royal guards entered first. Tall, armored figures whose glowing eyes scanned every corner of the chamber. Behind them walked a single elegant figure covered in dark flowing armor that seemed almost alive. Queen Aranthia had arrived. Even from a distance, her presence was powerful. The air in the room felt heavier as she stepped forward calmly, while every ambassador lowered their head in respect. No one dared speak. No one even dared move too much. Daniel quietly stepped back like he had been told, trying not to attract attention. He expected the Queen to move toward the council table where the most powerful leaders waited. But she didn't. Instead, her slow steps changed direction. Across the large chamber, her gaze moved calmly past dozens of alien leaders, past high-ranking commanders, and past the Royal Council seats, until finally her eyes stopped on someone standing near the wall. Daniel Hayes. For a moment, the entire room felt frozen in time. Daniel's heart started beating faster as the Queen began walking directly toward him, every step echoing softly across the chamber floor. Security officers looked confused, but none of them dared interfere. Daniel remembered the warning clearly: stay away from her. But now the most powerful being in the galaxy was walking straight toward him. She stopped only a few steps away and studied his face carefully, her expression calm, curious, almost thoughtful. Then, without saying a word, she slowly sat down in the chair directly across from him. The entire chamber watched in shocked silence. Daniel could only stare back in disbelief, one simple question repeating again and again in his mind. Why was the alien queen looking at him like she had been searching for him all along? And before the story continues, if you enjoy stories like this and want to explore more amazing HFY science fiction adventures, gently consider subscribing to this channel so you don't miss the next part of the journey. For several long seconds, the entire diplomatic chamber remained completely silent, as if the station itself had stopped breathing. Dozens of alien ambassadors stared in disbelief at the strange scene unfolding in front of them. The most powerful ruler in the galaxy had ignored every important leader in the room and instead chosen to sit across from a single human analyst who barely held any rank at all. Whispers slowly began spreading through the chamber like quiet waves. Some aliens leaned closer to one another, while others simply stared at Daniel, as if he had suddenly become the most dangerous being in the room. Daniel Hayes felt his heart beating harder with every passing second. He had read about Queen Aranthia in countless reports. He knew how powerful her empire was. He knew entire civilizations respected and feared her presence. Yet now she sat only a few feet away from him, her dark eyes studying him carefully, not with anger or arrogance, but with a calm curiosity that somehow made the moment even more uncomfortable. Station Commander Lauren finally stepped forward from the council platform, his tall, armored figure moving cautiously as if approaching a sleeping predator. He bowed respectfully toward the Queen before speaking in a controlled voice. "Your Majesty, this human is only a junior observer. If you wish, we can bring you to the council table where the other ambassadors are waiting." For a moment, the Queen did not respond. Her gaze remained fixed on Daniel, as though the rest of the room did not even exist. Then slowly she turned her head toward the commander. "Leave him," she said quietly. Her voice was calm, but the authority inside those two simple words was impossible to ignore. The commander immediately lowered his head again and stepped back without another argument. Around the chamber, several ambassadors shifted nervously, clearly unsure how to react to the situation. Daniel swallowed and forced himself to speak carefully. "Your Majesty, I think there might be some mistake." The Queen's eyes returned to him, calm and unreadable. "Mistake," she repeated softly, as if tasting the word for the first time. Daniel nodded slightly. "Try to remain respectful while also understanding what was happening. I'm not important here. I'm just an analyst. You probably meant to speak with someone from the council." For a brief moment, something unusual appeared in the Queen's expression. Not anger, not annoyance, but something closer to amusement. "I rarely make mistakes," she replied. Around them, the chamber had become completely silent again. Several alien diplomats were now openly watching the conversation, clearly fascinated by the strange interaction between the galactic ruler and the human observer. The Queen leaned slightly forward in her chair, her gaze sharpening with interest. "Tell me, Daniel Hayes, what do you see when you look around this room?" The sudden question caught him completely off guard. He blinked in surprise before slowly glancing around the chamber. Dozens of powerful species stood nearby, each one representing massive civilizations spread across entire star systems. "I see leaders," Daniel answered honestly, "important people from powerful worlds." The Queen studied him for a moment before shaking her head slightly. "No," she said calmly, "you see patterns." Daniel frowned slightly, unsure what she meant. "You observe behavior, communication, choices, she continued. That is what analysts do. They see what others ignore. Daniel remained quiet for a moment, trying to understand why she was even interested in his job. Before he could respond, another ambassador suddenly stepped forward, a tall reptilian diplomat whose species controlled several wealthy star systems. His yellow eyes narrowed suspiciously as he looked toward Daniel. Your Majesty, the reptilian ambassador said carefully, surely this human cannot be the focus of such attention. Humans are still a developing species. Their presence here is mostly symbolic. A few other ambassadors quietly agreed, small murmurs spreading across the chamber. The Queen slowly turned her head toward the reptilian diplomat, and the temperature of the room seemed to drop instantly. Symbolic, she repeated quietly. The ambassador suddenly looked less confident, but continued speaking. Yes, humans are curious, but they are not yet influential in galactic affairs. For several seconds, the Queen simply watched him in silence. Then she spoke again. Influence is often misunderstood, she said calmly. Power does not always come from age or territory. Her eyes slowly moved back toward Daniel again. Sometimes it comes from choice. The chamber once again fell silent. No one seemed sure what the Queen was implying, and Daniel himself felt even more confused than before. Commander Lauren finally cleared his throat carefully, trying to guide the meeting back to normal diplomacy. Your Majesty, perhaps the council discussion should begin. The Queen stood slowly from her seat, her movement graceful and controlled. Immediately, the entire chamber straightened with respect. The diplomatic meeting continued after that, but something had clearly changed. Throughout the discussion, Queen Aranthia spoke about trade routes, security treaties, and border disputes. Yet every few minutes her gaze quietly returned to Daniel, as if she was studying him again and again. By the time the meeting finally ended, the entire station was already buzzing with rumors. Why had the Queen chosen to sit with a human? Why had she defended him in front of the council? And most importantly, what had she meant when she spoke about choice? Daniel hoped the strange situation would end there. He quietly left the diplomatic chamber and returned to the human quarters of the station, trying to forget the uncomfortable attention he had received. But the galaxy rarely allowed strange moments to end so easily. Later that night, the station corridors were quiet. Most diplomats had already returned to their ships, and Daniel sat alone in his small living quarters reviewing data reports, trying to focus on work instead of the strange encounter earlier that day. Then suddenly there was a soft knock on his door. Daniel frowned slightly. Visitors at this hour were unusual. He stood up and walked toward the door before pressing the control panel beside it. The door slowly slid open, and Daniel immediately froze. Standing calmly in the hallway outside, surrounded by silent royal guards, was Queen Aranthia herself. The most powerful ruler in the galaxy had come directly to the room of a human analyst, and judging by the calm expression on her face, this visit had been planned from the very beginning. Daniel Hayes stood frozen in the doorway of his small living quarters, his mind struggling to process the impossible sight in front of him. The narrow hallway outside was dimly lit, and in that quiet light, the tall figure of Queen Aranthia seemed even more powerful and mysterious than she had inside the diplomatic chamber earlier that day. Behind her stood two silent royal guards wearing dark armor that reflected the corridor lights like black glass. Their glowing eyes watched everything carefully, yet neither of them moved or spoke, as if they were simply shadows standing beside their ruler. For a moment, Daniel wondered if this was some kind of mistake or a strange dream, because the most powerful ruler in the galaxy was now standing outside the door of a human analyst whose room was barely large enough for a desk and a bed. Your Majesty, Daniel finally managed to say, his voice quiet but respectful. Is there something I can help you with? The Queen studied him calmly for a few seconds before speaking, her voice low and steady. May I enter? She asked. The question itself surprised Daniel even more than her presence. A galactic ruler asking permission to enter his room felt almost unreal. Yes, of course, he said quickly, stepping aside. The Queen moved forward with smooth, controlled steps. The royal guards remained outside, without speaking as the door slowly closed behind her, leaving Daniel alone with the most feared leader in the galaxy. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet hum of the station's life support systems filled the small room. Daniel suddenly became very aware of how ordinary his living quarters looked. Several data screens floated above his desk, scattered notes and reports covered the table, and a half-finished cup of coffee still sat near his chair. Queen Aranthia slowly looked around the room, her sharp eyes observing every small detail as if each object carried some hidden meaning. "This is where you live," she said calmly. Daniel nodded awkwardly. "Yes, it's not very impressive." The queen looked at him again, and something in her expression softened slightly. "Impressive places are often the least honest," she replied quietly. Daniel wasn't sure what that meant, but before he could ask another question, she walked toward the small window on the far wall, where distant stars glowed softly in the dark vacuum outside. For a few seconds, she simply watched the stars in silence. Then she spoke again without turning around. "Tell me about your world," she said. Daniel blinked in surprise. "Earth." "Yes," she replied. He hesitated slightly, trying to understand why someone like her would be interested in such a simple topic, but eventually he began speaking. "Earth is complicated," he said slowly. "It's beautiful in some places and chaotic in others. Humans don't always agree with each other. We argue, we compete, sometimes we even fight. But we also build things together, cities, art, technology, and sometimes we help each other even when we don't have to." The queen listened carefully, still watching the distant stars. "And when you fight," she asked, "why do you continue even when the outcome seems impossible?" Daniel thought about that question for a moment before answering. "I guess because humans don't like giving up," he said. "Even when something looks hopeless, we still try. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, but stopping feels worse than losing." The queen slowly turned to face him again, and for the first time, Daniel noticed a faint spark of interest in her eyes. "Your species is unusual," she said. Daniel gave a small, uncertain smile. "We hear that a lot." She took a few steps closer, her presence filling the small room in a way that made the space feel much smaller than before. "Most species value survival above all else," she explained calmly. "They retreat when defeat becomes likely. They preserve their strength. They calculate risk carefully." Daniel nodded slightly. "That sounds reasonable." "Yes," the queen replied, "but humans often choose a different path." Daniel crossed his arms thoughtfully. "Sometimes we're just stubborn." For a brief moment, the queen almost looked amused again. "Stubbornness can be a powerful force," she said. The room grew quiet once more, the soft hum of machines filling the silence between them. Daniel could feel that this conversation was moving towards something important, something she had come here specifically to discuss. Finally, he asked the question that had been bothering him since the diplomatic meeting. "Why did you choose to sit with me today?" The queen did not answer immediately. She studied his face again, as if carefully measuring something invisible. "Because you're the only one in that room who is not pretending," she said. Daniel frowned slightly. "Pretending about what?" "About power," she replied calmly. Daniel wasn't sure how to respond to that. But before he could speak again, the queen continued. "You watched everyone in that chamber the same way you watch your data screens," she explained, quietly, carefully analyzing patterns. Daniel shrugged slightly. "That's my job." "Yes," she said softly. "And you're very good at it." For several seconds, neither of them spoke again. Then the queen stepped closer to the door, as if preparing to leave. But just before she reached it, she paused and looked back at Daniel one last time. "Soon others will begin asking questions about you," she said quietly. Daniel felt a small chill run down his spine. "Why?" The queen's expression returned to its calm, unreadable state. "Because they will notice the same thing I did," she answered. "And what exactly did you notice?" Daniel asked carefully. The queen opened the door. The silent royal guards immediately straightened in the hallway outside. Before stepping out, she turned slightly and spoke one final sentence. "They will notice that humans do not behave the way the galaxy expects them to." Then she walked away down the corridor with her guards following behind her, leaving Daniel standing alone in his small room with more questions than answers. And by the next morning, those questions had already begun spreading across the entire station. Because news traveled fast in a place filled with diplomats and spies, and now everyone knew the same shocking rumor. The Alien Queen had personally visited a human during the night. And in the politics of the galaxy, a ruler like her never did anything without a reason. By the next morning, Orion Gate Station no longer felt calm and orderly like it usually did. The long silver corridors that were normally filled with quiet diplomatic activity had turned into places of constant whispers and suspicious glances. News had spread faster than anyone expected. Almost every species on the station had already heard the same unbelievable rumor. The Alien Queen herself had visited the private quarters of a human during the night. And not just any human, but Daniel Hayes, a low-ranking analyst who only a day earlier had been completely invisible to the rest of the galaxy. Now everywhere Daniel walked, he could feel eyes following him. Insect-like diplomats stopped their conversations when he passed. Tall reptilian envoys watched him carefully from across the halls. Even some human officers seemed confused and nervous around him, as if he had suddenly become a problem they did not know how to solve. Daniel tried to ignore the attention as he entered the observation chamber where he usually worked, but he barely had time to sit down before the door behind him opened sharply. Commander Lauren walked inside with two security officers following close behind. His expression was serious in a way that made Daniel immediately uneasy. "Daniel Hayes," the commander said firmly, "you are coming with us." Daniel sighed quietly. He had expected something like this to happen sooner or later. "Let me guess," he said while standing up slowly. "This is about the Queen." Commander Lauren did not smile. "Everything on this station is about the Queen right now," he replied. They led Daniel through several restricted corridors he had never seen before, eventually stopping outside a sealed meeting chamber deep inside the administrative section of the station. When the doors opened, Daniel immediately realized this was not a normal conversation. Inside the room, several powerful alien representatives were already waiting, including the reptilian ambassador who had questioned the Queen during the meeting yesterday, along with two tall crystalline beings whose glowing forms shifted slowly like living glass. The moment Daniel entered the room, the reptilian ambassador spoke first, his sharp yellow eyes fixed on the human analyst with clear suspicion. "So this is the human she chose," he said coldly. Daniel looked around the room, feeling the pressure of multiple alien species studying him like a strange object. "I didn't realize I was being chosen for anything," he replied calmly. One of the crystalline beings slowly floated closer, its voice echoing softly through a translation device. "The Queen does nothing without purpose," the being said. "If she approached you personally, then it was not random." Daniel crossed his arms slightly, trying to remain calm despite the uncomfortable attention. Maybe she was just curious. The reptilian ambassador gave a short, humorless laugh. "Curiosity from a ruler who commands half the galaxy," he said. "That is not something we take lightly." Commander Lauren stepped forward then, clearly trying to keep the conversation controlled. "We simply want to understand the situation," he explained. "Did the Queen tell you anything important during her visit?" Daniel hesitated for a moment before answering honestly. "She asked about Earth," he said, "about humans, about how we think and why we fight." That answer immediately caused several of the aliens in the room to exchange uneasy looks. Why would she care about such things? The reptilian ambassador muttered suspiciously. Before Daniel could respond, the chamber doors suddenly opened again, and every being in the room immediately fell silent. Queen Aranthia stepped inside calmly, her presence instantly changing the atmosphere of the room, like a sudden storm appearing in a clear sky. Her royal guards remained outside while she walked toward the center of the chamber with slow, confident steps. "I see the council has already begun its investigation," she said quietly. No one dared interrupt her. Even the reptilian ambassador lowered his head slightly. "Your Majesty," Commander Lauren said respectfully, "we were only trying to understand the situation." The Queen looked around the room at each alien leader before finally speaking again. "You are afraid," she said calmly. The reptilian ambassador lifted his head quickly. Afraid of what? The Queen's eyes slowly moved toward Daniel. Afraid that I have noticed something you have ignored, she replied. A heavy silence filled the room. One of the crystalline beings spoke carefully. Then perhaps you should explain it to the council. For several seconds the Queen remained quiet, as if deciding how much truth she was willing to reveal. Finally she spoke again, her voice calm, but serious in a way that made everyone listen closely. Thousands of years ago, she began, long before many of your civilizations existed, the galaxy faced an enemy unlike any other. The reptilian ambassador frowned slightly. Ancient history, he said dismissively. But the Queen ignored him and continued speaking. This enemy did not conquer worlds, she explained. It erased them. Entire civilizations disappeared without warning, their cities empty, their fleets destroyed, their people gone. The crystalline beings shifted uneasily, clearly recognizing the story. You speak of the silent devourers, one of them said, quietly. The Queen nodded once. They came without emotion, without diplomacy, without mercy, she continued, and every species in the galaxy failed to stop them. Daniel listened carefully, realizing this was not just a simple history lesson. But eventually they disappeared, Commander Lawrence said. Our records say they vanished. Yes, the Queen replied softly, but they did not vanish because they were defeated. That sentence made the entire room fall silent again. The reptilian ambassador stared at her in disbelief. Then why did they leave? He demanded. The Queen's gaze slowly returned to Daniel Hayes, standing quietly near the back of the chamber. Because something appeared that they could not understand, she said. Daniel felt a strange chill run down his spine as every alien in the room slowly turned to look at him again. The Queen's voice remained calm as she finished her explanation. A species that continues fighting even when defeat is certain, she said. A species that protects the weak instead of abandoning them. A species that refuses to surrender even when logic demands it. The reptilian ambassador shook his head in disbelief. You cannot be suggesting that primitive humans are connected to that ancient war. The Queen did not argue. She simply spoke one quiet sentence that made the entire room uneasy. I am suggesting that the same qualities which once confused our enemy now exist again. She paused briefly before adding something even more disturbing. And if the Devourers ever return to this galaxy, those same qualities may be the only reason any of us survive. The chamber remained silent after that, the alien leaders slowly realizing the weight of what she was implying. But before anyone could ask another question, the station alarms suddenly began echoing through the corridors outside. A loud automated voice repeated the same warning across the entire station. Unidentified fleet detected entering system. Unknown vessels approaching Orion Gate. And in that moment, everyone in the chamber understood the same terrifying possibility. Something had just arrived in the system, and it might be connected to the very enemy the Queen had just spoken about. The sudden alarm echoing through Orion Gate Station changed the atmosphere instantly. The quiet tension inside the council chamber turned into sharp urgency. Red emergency lights began flashing along the walls, while distant voices of station personnel could be heard rushing through the corridors outside. Every alien leader in the room looked toward the ceiling as the automated warning repeated again and again. Unidentified fleet detected unknown vessels approaching the station. Commander Lauren immediately moved toward the communication console on the wall, activating several holographic displays at once. Bright blue projections of the surrounding star system appeared above the table, showing dozens of small blinking signals slowly entering the outer range of the station sensors. The reptilian ambassador leaned closer to the display, his narrow eyes studying the unknown signals carefully. These are not registered trade ships, he said sharply. They are moving in a formation. One of the crystalline beings floated nearer as well, its glowing body shifting nervously. Their technology does not match any known fleet in our records, it added. For several seconds the chamber filled with tense silence as everyone realized the same thing. Something unknown had arrived in the system, and it had arrived in numbers. Queen Aranthia watched the holographic display quietly, her expression calm but thoughtful. Then she slowly turned toward Daniel Hayes, who still stood near the back of the room. "This situation may provide an opportunity," she said quietly. The reptilian ambassador frowned in confusion. "Opportunity for what?" he asked. The Queen's gaze remained fixed on Daniel. "To demonstrate what I have been explaining," she replied. Daniel felt a strange feeling in his stomach as several alien leaders suddenly looked at him again. The reptilian ambassador crossed his arms impatiently. "You are referring to the human again," he said, clearly annoyed. "Your Majesty, with respect, we are dealing with a potential threat. This is hardly the moment for philosophical experiments." The Queen did not react to his tone. Instead, she calmly addressed the entire council. "Every species in this chamber claims to understand strength," she said. "But most of you define strength as survival, as preservation of power and territory." The crystalline being spoke carefully. "That is the logical definition." "Yes," the Queen replied. "Logical, predictable, and often cowardly." The insult hung in the air like a sharp blade. Several ambassadors looked offended, but none of them dared openly challenge her authority. Then she gestured toward the holographic display, where a small cargo transport icon blinked near the edge of the system. "That ship," she said. Commander Lauren adjusted the display quickly, zooming in on the small vessel. "It's a civilian transport," he confirmed. "Engine failure, it drifted near the outer system a few hours ago, and it is now directly in the path of the unknown fleet," the Queen added quietly. The room grew silent again as everyone understood the situation. The damaged ship had no weapons, no defenses, and no ability to escape. "How many passengers?" the reptilian ambassador asked. Commander Lauren checked the data quickly. 32 life signs, he answered. The reptilian ambassador gave a small, frustrated hiss. "Then they're already lost," he said bluntly. "We cannot risk the station for a damaged transport." A few other ambassadors quietly agreed, some nodding their heads in silent acceptance of the harsh but practical decision. Queen Aranthia slowly turned her head toward Daniel again. "What would a human do?" she asked calmly. Daniel blinked in surprise, not expecting the question to come so suddenly. "I'm not a military officer," he replied carefully. "That was not the question," the Queen said softly. The entire room waited for his answer. Daniel looked at the holographic image of the drifting transport ship, imagining the people trapped inside, waiting for help that might never come. Then he spoke quietly. "A human ship would go get them," he said. The reptilian ambassador immediately shook his head in disbelief. "And lose another ship in the process," he replied. "Maybe," Daniel admitted. "But they would still try," he added. The Queen nodded slightly, almost as if she had expected exactly that answer. Commander Lauren sighed and rubbed his forehead. "Even if we wanted to attempt a rescue, our nearest patrol ship is too far away," he explained, "and the unknown fleet will reach that transport in less than 30 minutes. For a moment, the chamber remained silent again. Then the Queen spoke the words that changed everything. "Send Daniel Hayes," she said calmly. Every alien in the room immediately turned toward her in shock. The reptilian ambassador almost laughed out loud. "Send the human analyst," he repeated. "In what ship?" Commander Lauren hesitated before answering. "There is a small emergency scout vessel docked in the lower hangar." The reptilian ambassador looked even more confused. "That vessel has no combat capability." The Queen's voice remained calm. "This is not a battle," she said. "It is a choice." Then she looked directly at Daniel. "Will you go?" she asked. Daniel felt the weight of every alien gaze in the room. This was no longer just a conversation about philosophy or human behavior. Now the situation was real. 32 lives were drifting in space, while an unknown fleet approached them. He took a slow breath before answering. "Yes," he said simply. The reptilian ambassador shook his head again. "Madness," he muttered. But the Queen did not look surprised at all. In fact, her calm expression suggested she had expected this moment from the very beginning. Commander Lauren finally nodded toward the security officers. "Prepare the scout vessel," he ordered. Minutes later, Daniel stood inside the small hangar bay where the emergency scout ship waited. It was a compact silver craft barely large enough for two people. Its engines hummed quietly as technicians rushed around it making last-minute adjustments. Through the wide hangar window, Daniel could see the distant stars outside, and somewhere out there a damaged civilian ship was drifting slowly toward an unknown fleet that no one in the galaxy recognized. As he climbed into the pilot's seat, a message suddenly appeared on the console screen. A private transmission from Queen Aranthia herself. Daniel activated the message, and her calm voice filled the cockpit. "Remember this moment," she said quietly, "because soon the entire galaxy will see what humans choose to do when everyone else has already given up." The scout ship engines roared softly as the hangar doors slowly opened. And far out in the dark emptiness of space, the unknown fleet continued moving closer. The small emergency scout vessel shot out of the Orion Gate hangar like a silver arrow disappearing into the endless darkness of space. Its engines burned bright for a moment before fading into the distance. Inside the cockpit, Daniel Hayes gripped the controls tightly while the starfield stretched across the front window. The damaged civilian transport appeared as a small blinking signal on the navigation display, drifting slowly and helplessly through space, and far beyond it another group of signals moved in silent formation, the unknown fleet. Daniel could feel the quiet pressure of the moment growing heavier with every passing second. The scout vessel was fast but lightly built. It carried no serious weapons. Only basic scanners and a small rescue bay designed for emergency evacuations. Whoever those approaching ships belonged to, this tiny vessel would not survive a direct confrontation. The console suddenly chimed softly. A secure communication channel had opened automatically. Queen Aranthia appeared on the holographic screen in front of him, her calm face illuminated by the faint blue light of the projection. She seemed exactly the same as she had inside the council chamber, controlled, thoughtful, almost impossibly calm considering the situation unfolding across the star system. "You launched without hesitation," she said quietly. Daniel kept his eyes on the navigation screen while he answered. "There are people out there," he replied simply. Hesitating wouldn't help them. For a moment, the Queen watched him silently, studying the human in the small cockpit as stars rushed past outside the vessel window. "Your species continues to surprise me," she said after a few seconds. Daniel allowed himself a small nervous laugh. "I get the feeling this entire situation was planned," he said. The Queen did not deny it. "In part," she answered calmly. Daniel finally glanced toward the holographic image of her. "So this really is a test," he said. "Yes," she replied without hesitation. The direct answer made Daniel raise an eyebrow slightly. "That's a lot of risk for a demonstration," he said. "Only if you fail," the Queen responded softly. Daniel returned his attention to the controls as the damaged civilian transport slowly grew larger on the forward display. Its engines were dark, its hull drifting slowly in a wide rotation. "You said earlier that the galaxy misunderstands strength," Daniel said after a moment, "but you still haven't explained why that matters right now." For a few seconds, the Queen did not answer, as if considering how much truth she wanted to reveal. Then finally she spoke again, her voice quieter than before. "Because something is coming," she said. Daniel glanced at the sensor screen again, where the unknown fleet icons moved closer and closer to the transport vessel. "You think those ships are connected to the enemy you mentioned earlier?" he asked. "I do not know yet," the Queen replied. "But the pattern is familiar." Daniel frowned slightly. "Pattern?" "Yes," she continued. "A silent approach, no communication, no attempt at negotiation, just quiet observation before action." Daniel felt a small chill run down his spine. The way she described it did not sound like normal diplomacy or even normal warfare. It sounded more like a predator studying its prey. "Thousands of years ago," the Queen continued, "when the Devourers first appeared, most civilizations reacted logically. They preserved their fleets, they retreated from losing battles, they protected their strongest worlds and abandoned their weaker ones. That sounds like strategy, Daniel said carefully. Yes, the Queen replied. It was intelligent, efficient, and completely ineffective. Daniel slowly nodded, beginning to understand where she was going with the story. The Devourers did not think like us, she explained. They did not fear losses. They did not value territory. They simply continued advancing until nothing remained in their path. Daniel looked back toward the drifting civilian transport again, now only a few thousand kilometers away. Emergency lights flashed weakly along its hull. So what stopped them? He asked quietly. The Queen's eyes met his through the holographic screen. Something unexpected, she said. Daniel waited for her to continue. A civilization that behaved in a way the Devourers could not predict, she explained slowly. A species that fought battles they could not win, defended allies who had no strategic value, and refused to retreat even when defeat was certain. Daniel stared at the screen for a moment before speaking again. You think humans are like that, he said. The Queen nodded once. I believe humans are exactly like that, she replied. Daniel turned his attention back to the controls as he guided the scout ship closer to the damaged transport vessel. Its hull now clearly visible outside the cockpit window. Small escape pods were attached to its sides, but none of them had launched. The passengers inside were clearly waiting for help that might never have come. So the real reason you chose me, Daniel said slowly, was to prove your theory to the Council. Partly, the Queen answered. Daniel narrowed his eyes slightly. Partly, he repeated. Yes, she said, because there's another reason. The scout vessel finally reached docking range. Daniel activated the rescue clamps and carefully guided the ship toward the transport's damaged airlock. What's the other reason? He asked while focusing on the maneuver. For a moment, the Queen remained silent. Then she answered with a quiet honesty that surprised him. Because if the Devourers truly have returned, she said, then the galaxy will need someone who understands the strength of your species. Daniel finished locking the scout ship to the damaged transport. The docking clamps sealed with a heavy metallic sound. And you think that someone is me? He said. The Queen's expression remained calm, but serious. I think you represent something the galaxy has forgotten, she replied. Daniel disconnected the harness from his seat and prepared to enter the transport vessel. 32 passengers were waiting inside, scared and helpless, completely unaware that their rescue mission had just become part of a much larger story. Before leaving the cockpit, he looked one last time at the sensor display. The unknown fleet had moved closer again, their signals now only minutes away from the transport ship. Then he looked back at the holographic image of Queen Aranthia. Well, Daniel said quietly, I guess we're about to find out if your theory about humans is correct. Outside the small rescue ship, the dark shapes of the approaching vessels slowly appeared against the distant stars. And whatever those ships truly were, they were about to witness exactly how far a single human was willing to go to save strangers. The docking clamps of the small scout vessel locked firmly against the damaged civilian transport with a deep metallic sound that echoed through the narrow hull. Inside the cockpit, Daniel Hayes took a slow breath before opening the internal hatch. The corridor beyond was dark and silent, except for the faint flicker of emergency lights reflecting along the walls. Somewhere deeper inside the ship, dozens of frightened passengers were waiting, unaware that an unknown fleet was already approaching. Their position in the cold darkness of space. Daniel stepped inside carefully, his boots touching the floor of the powerless transport while the faint sound of distant voices reached his ears. People were still alive. That was the only thing that mattered right now. He moved quickly through the narrow corridor, following the weak emergency lights until he reached the main passenger chamber where the survivors had gathered. When the door opened, several nervous faces immediately turned toward him. Some of them clearly surprised to see only a single human rescuer standing in the doorway. Is the station sending help? One older passenger asked anxiously. Daniel gave a calm nod, even though the situation was far more complicated than they realized. Yes, he said simply, but we need to move quickly. He quickly explained that his small scout ship could only carry a limited number of people at once. The evacuation would have to be organized carefully. Small groups would move through the docking hatch while the others waited, Every minute mattered now, because the unknown fleet continued to move closer across the star system. Back on Orion Gate Station, the council chamber had turned into a command center. Holographic screens covered the room, showing the same dangerous scene unfolding in space. The drifting transport, the tiny scout vessel attached to it, and the approaching fleet of unidentified ships, whose dark shapes were now clearly visible on the long-range sensors. Dozens of alien leaders watched the situation with tense silence. The reptilian ambassador crossed his arms while studying the tactical display, his expression still filled with doubt. One small scout ship cannot evacuate 32 passengers before those vessels arrive, he said. This rescue mission will fail. Queen Aranthia stood quietly near the main display, her eyes focused on the tiny icon representing Daniel's vessel. Perhaps, she replied calmly. Minutes passed slowly as Daniel and the survivors moved between the ships, the small rescue bay filled with frightened passengers who were quickly secured in safety harnesses. Then the scout vessel detached and flew back toward Orion Gate at maximum speed. After releasing the first group at the station, Daniel immediately turned the ship around and rushed back toward the drifting transport again. Inside the council chamber, many alien leaders watched the repeated trips with growing disbelief. He is going back, one of the crystalline beings said quietly. Of course he is, Queen Aranthia replied. Trip after trip, the small vessel raced through space, its engines burning bright against the darkness while the unknown fleet continued its slow, silent approach. By the time Daniel returned for the final group of passengers, the sensor alarms had grown louder across the station. The unidentified ships were now clearly visible through long-range telescopes. Dark angular vessels moving in perfect formation like predators closing in on wounded prey. Inside the transport ship, the last remaining survivors hurried toward the docking hatch, while Daniel helped guide them through the narrow corridor. Fear filled the air, but no one panicked. Every person understood that the human pilot, risking his life for them, was their only chance to escape. Back on Orion Gate, the reptilian ambassador suddenly leaned closer to the display, his eyes narrowing as new data appeared across the sensor screens. The unidentified fleet has changed course, he said sharply. Commander Lauren immediately activated another scan. They are not attacking the station, he confirmed. The entire chamber watched as the dark ships slowed their approach and stopped several thousand kilometers away from the drifting transport, almost as if they were simply observing the rescue operation from a distance. Queen Aranthia studied the display carefully, a quiet understanding appearing in her eyes. They are watching, she said softly. Meanwhile, Daniel sealed the final passenger inside the scout vessel and returned to the cockpit. The transport ship was now completely empty, its corridors silent once again. He quickly activated the engines and pulled the small vessel away from the drifting hull, just as the unknown fleet became visible through the cockpit window. Dozens of massive dark ships hung motionless in the distance, their strange surfaces reflecting the distant starlight like shadows floating in space. Daniel's hands tightened on the controls. The ships did not attack. They simply remained there, silent and unmoving. Back on Orion Gate, the council chamber watched the same scene unfold on the holographic displays. No weapons fired, no communication signals appeared. The mysterious fleet simply observed the small human vessel carrying the rescued passengers back toward the station. After several long moments, the unknown ships slowly turned away, their engines glowing faintly as they disappeared back into the darkness of deep space. No battle had taken place, no threats had been spoken, yet the message left behind felt strangely clear. Inside the council chamber, the reptilian ambassador stared at the display in disbelief. They retreated, he said quietly. Queen Aranthia finally turned away from the screen and looked around the silent room, filled with alien leaders who had witnessed the entire event. Not because of weapons, she said calmly. Not because of fleets, but because they saw something they could not predict. At that exact moment, Daniel's small scout vessel entered the docking bay of Orion Gate. The rescued passengers stepped out safely while station personnel rushed to help them. Moments later, Daniel himself walked back into the council chamber where the alien leaders waited. For a moment, no one spoke. The room that once looked at him with suspicion now watched him with something very different. Respect. Queen Aranthia stepped forward slightly and looked at him with a calm, approving expression. "You did exactly what I expected," she said quietly. Daniel shrugged tiredly. "I just help people," he replied. The queen nodded once, then spoke the sentence that changed how the galaxy would remember this moment forever. "The day the alien queen chose to sit across from a human," she said softly, "was the day the galaxy finally remembered what courage looks like. And from that moment forward, humans were no longer seen as the youngest or weakest species among the stars. They were the species that chose to help, even when the rest of the galaxy had already given up